Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending. Norton told me that we've extended the time limit and I can speak for about 3.5 hours. So just plan your schedule according to my talk. Thank you, Norton. Let me start with the ideology of Iran's foreign policy, and then I'll delve more into my beat, which is Europe. I've spent nearly 13 years in Europe reporting on Iran, Hezbollah, European-Israeli relations. There's been a lot of Hezbollah activity in Europe, as you know. It's a legal organization. Right now the political wing is legal. It's only banned in one European country, the Netherlands, fully banned, and the rest of Europe, the 28, 27 members, still allow Hezbollah to organize. Of Iran, and I think Michael neatly captured the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran. It's now being viewed as a strategic partnership, and that'll be my departure point for this talk. I don't think it's a proxy organization anymore, rather a strategic partnership. Iran is the first country since the Holocaust, since the dissolution of the Hitler movement, Nazi Germany, that promotes a foreign policy that wants to commit a new genocide against Jewry and many non-Jews living in Israel. So we have a unique situation here, a very terrifying situation, because this type of genocidal ideology hasn't been internalized, from my perspective, in many quarters of the counterterrorism community. And the U.S. State Department, of course, has acknowledged that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. But I think it's important to remember that we're dealing with a foreign policy that advocates a form of lethal anti-Semitism. Now, to dovetail on that point, and this is what I've noticed over the last few months, and many of you have also, I'm sure, observed this, there's been a mainstreaming of the Iranian regime since Hassan Rouhani was, I'm putting this in scary quotes, elected president, because as we know that wasn't a real election in any sense of the democratic process. And this mainstreaming of the regime, turning a regime that really is a pariah regime, a rogue state, into something that's politically and socially correct is very dangerous. Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, it's just worth remembering that, putting aside his smiles and his very charismatic way of moving and his Western education, recently this year laid a wreath at Imad Mughnaya's grave in Lebanon. He was responsible for played a role in the 1983 suicide attack on U.S. Marine barracks, which killed 241 Americans. For whatever reason, this episode, again, was a footnote factor. It was hardly reported on in Europe. There was more media attention in the States. There's also been, I think, a lot of intellectual media chatter about Zarif and his fluent English speaking skills. And again, I think this argument needs to be dismissed quickly. For example, many of you might remember that Pol Pot was educated in France and then went back to Cambodia and became a murderous psychopath. And we all remember the film The Killing Fields. So it's not, and another example, of course, is Bashar al-Assad, who was educated in London as an ophthalmologist and now is killed. Probably the real number is, the number of deaths in Syria is 200,000. So we're dealing with psychopaths on a level of, at least in recent history, an unprecedented level of spectacular violence, although they've been Western educated. One other point I just wanted to make about this is Jack Straw, the former foreign minister for the United Kingdom, recently traveled to Iran as part of these delegations of politicians who are going there, and also business companies. You might have seen I wrote about this, the Dutch ambassador to Iran tweeted that he's conducting speed dating sessions with Iranian businesses. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of mainstreaming the Iranian regime. It's now become a relationship where Europe wants to speed date Iran. And Straw said, I'm quoting him from The Independent, where he wrote an article,
quote, "There are more American PhDs in Iranian President Hassan Rouhani's cabinet than there are in US President Barack Obama's cabinet." So you get the sense we're dealing with someone who's a big fan of a totalitarian regime and is sort of doing their public relations work and as well as their economic ministry work. But what he forgot to mention in terms of Rouhani's cabinet, and again, this plays into Iran's global terrorism and its domestic terrorism, is that its Justice Minister, Pour Mohammadi, massacred thousands of political prisoners in 1988 in Iran, and Iran's Defense Minister, Hossein Degna, played a critical role in the bombing of the U.S. military barracks in 1983. I don't know if they have PhDs, but you get the sense that we're not dealing with, we're dealing with very bad actors. And one other factor I wanted to mention, because this is important for Europe, because Europe, as many of you know, at least champions the rhetoric of human rights. Although, if you look at the Iranian example, much of their, their battle cry for human rights is on one side of the fence and their actions are on the other side of the fence. But they have sanctioned Iranian officials for human rights violations, as the Obama administration, to its credit, did sanction in 2009 after the Green Revolution, Iranian officials who were involved in that violent clampdown. But my point is, when I talk to Iranian experts, dissidents in the diaspora about Iran, one point that they stress over and over is, why is the West ignoring Iranian domestic terrorism? I'm using a very expansive definition of terrorism because the Iranian regime, as many of you know, terrorizes its population. And I think it's a good point, especially in light of Rouhani's presidency, because the number of executions has soared. He's exceeding his predecessor, Ahmadinejad, in terms of the killing spree. There was a very notable case that took place last month involving Hasham Shabani, an Iranian Arab poet, a 32-year-old poet who was hanged simply because he was writing poetry for greater cultural and political rights for the Awazi Arab community in Iran. It was reported by one journalist, Amir Tahari, that Rouhani actually ordered his execution because he was responsible for his file and had visited that region of Iran shortly before he was executed. Today I just read that Iran, in the Washington Free Beacon, executed 2 Iranians yesterday. They're presumably gay for perversion. That was yesterday, Sunday, and a third individual for insulting the Prophet Muhammad. So I hope this will make it into at least page 10 of the New York Times, buried at the bottom somewhere. But these are important developments. In terms of Iran and Hezbollah in Europe, there's a long history of assassinations. The most famous example, at least where I'm from, Germany, is the Mykonos restaurant assassination, where a German court actually convicted Rafsanjani, the former president, of assassinating Iranian Kurds in a Greek restaurant in West Berlin. The Iran's president was implicated in the attack, and there were arrests made. Germany, unfortunately, released the terrorist a number of years ago. I think it was 2008, if I'm not mistaken. So they served a very short sentence, 7, someone say? That gives you a sense of sort of the European, at times, uber appeasement, because there was a quid pro quo where the Iranians captured a German fisherman who was arrested and detained, and the Germans decided to release these terrorists who killed Iranian Kurds in exchange for his release. Now, I just want to jump into the future, or into Burgess. Let me just have a sip here since we've got 2 more hours. The Burgess attack, which Michael mentioned, took place July 18, 2012, in the Black Sea resort. I was in Israel at the time, and I remember in one of the delis, I'll call it, there was the screens were blanketed with coverage of what took place. 5 Israelis were killed, and their Bulgarian bus driver. And there's at least 3 suspects involved. 2 were, as the Bulgarian Interior Ministry declared in February of 2013, part of Hezbollah's military wing. Israel and the United States declared this to be, it's interesting, and it sort of got lost in the reporting afterwards, to be a joint Iran-Hezbollah operation. And the Israelis intercepted phone calls, which haven't been released because it would compromise sources, showing telephone interceptions or communication between Lebanon and Bulgaria. So there's clear-cut evidence that this was a Hezbollah attack. The role of Iran's unclear. When I was doing my reporting in Bulgaria, I discovered a Bulgarian source told me in Sofia when I was there, I've been there twice, that there was an Iranian agent who was arrested at the Chabad Center. Initially, I was told it was the Sofia synagogue, this large, sprawling Sephardic synagogue, but it was actually the Chabad Center, and I called them up, and I said, I have this source, and the rabbi told me, please don't write about this. Security told us to be quiet. They arrested an Iranian woman. So it was a Canadian Iranian woman, which was interesting, who was later taken to Hungary, and then it's unclear where she is right now. But she was surveilling the Chabad Center at the exact same time as the Burgas attack. So it's interesting to see this type of coordination that was taking place. There was another Iranian man who tried to enter Bulgaria at the same time. He was detained at the border. The reason Bulgaria was targeted, it's pretty simple. It has a very weak, very feeble security system. The borders are very porous, and Hezbollah did their homework, and they unfortunately succeeded. This case is, I think, important to show Hezbollah's reach in Europe, because they entered through, at least one of the suspects entered through Poland, built the bomb on his way from Warsaw to Bulgaria, went to the Czech Republic in the airport, and then worked his way over to Sofia. When they fled, at least one or two of them, it's still unclear, went from Bulgaria to Romania to at that point, we're not sure, probably somehow got to Turkey. So they were using Europe as their backyard because the Europeans weren't taking this seriously. As I was following this case, I thought at one point, because the foreign minister of, at that time, of Cyprus declared Hezbollah to be, which is the usual rhetoric, I can find the exact quote, a social service organization. And the jury's still out, and a political organization, to see whether they were really behind this attack. That was just a week or so after the attack took place, and Foreign Minister Lieberman at the time was in Brussels trying to push her to take a more assertive position, but she said, again, we're sort of dealing with, cognitive behavioral therapists who are treating their, clients in southern Beirut. It's not in providing social services. It's not really a terrorist organization. This was the European thinking, at least among many of the countries. Burgas changed things, of course. I thought at the time that the Israelis were going to invoke some type of Munich idea, because if you remember the Munich attack in '72 in Germany, the reason, and Steven Spielberg got this wrong in his film, the reason the Israelis went after the terrorists, the Black September group, wasn't because of some sense of Jewish revenge or these crazy ideas that I think came across in that film, but rather because the Europeans were releasing all the Black September terrorists. They were being apprehended in France, in Germany, and the governments were just saying, we don't want to deal with this, and they were released. So Golda Meir, the prime minister at the time, of course, made the right decision because of soggy European uber appeasement, and decided to go after them. I was really on the edge of my seat to see what the Israelis were going to do in terms of Burgas. But they did their homework. The Europeans eventually designated Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist organization roughly a year later, in July, I think it was 22nd, 2013. So their military wing is designated. Of course, that's an artificial distinction. It's a monolithic organization. The Europeans are playing, in my view, a phony game. They realize that the organization's a terrorist organization, but they want to have some type of communication line open. Just a few months ago, I reported on the French ambassador to Lebanon holding a dinner occasion honoring Hezbollah MPs in Beirut. When I wrote the story for the Jerusalem Post, the French embassy in Israel called me up, and they were going in a state of panic. He didn't honor him. They had a dinner, and I was going back and forth with the diplomat, but it was clear it was some type of a honorary ceremony. Let me just jump ahead here because I know how much time do I have now? I have a few minutes, okay. I've got at least 20 more pages to go through. Do it? Let me then cover, I think, the Iran and al-Qaeda. That's a point Michael addressed too. It sounds very counterintuitive that Iran, Shiite state, would align themselves with this radical terroristic Sunni organization. But what I've seen in Germany, and there's been some interesting examples, is the second 9/11 cell in Hamburg. It was formed with a guy named Ahmad Wali Siddiqui, who was convicted of terrorism in 2012. I attended his trial. This was the second 9/11 cell. The Germans, it took them, I think, 10 years to shut down the mosque where al-Qaeda, which launched the 9/11 plot. So again, it gives you a sense of, the European mindset compared to the U.S. mindset, that it took them 10 years. The argument, of course, was, well, we were observing the terrorists, and yes, there was a lot of jihadi tourism taking place and folks visiting the mosque to honor it, but they eventually shut it down because they realized that it was being used to send new German Muslims to Pakistan and Afghanistan to wage war against NATO and American troops. But what was interesting about this trial involving Siddiqui, and I wrote about this in the Weekly Standard, is having attended the trial for several weeks, was Iran kept surfacing. That a number of the terrorists from this cell went from Vienna to Iran, to Tehran. They stayed in a hotel, and then they would work their way to Pakistan. And so the Iranians were obviously assisting them, and the Iranians, of course, have placed a number of al-Qaeda terrorists under sort of a loose form of house arrest. A lot of them have had wide latitude. So the Iranians are actually using al-Qaeda in many ways for their political and terroristic purposes. And I think that's important to get that across, the role of al-Qaeda. Recently, Yassin al-Suri, another al-Qaeda official in Iran, was allowed to be released, and he's been conducting work in Syria. The U.S. has placed a $10 million bounty or a reward on his case. There's been other examples of al-Qaeda working with Iran. The Canadian example last year where I think it was a Tunisian, and I'm not sure, it was a Palestinian, I think Linda Frum's here from Canada, senator. She can help me out or correct me later. And both of those terrorists were affiliated with al-Qaeda, with Iran. So you can see this network. That they wanted to blow up a train from Toronto on its way to New York. I would just end on this point in terms of prescription, since I'm affiliated with a think tank, and too often the think part of the think tank is emphasized over the tank part. So I want to jump into the tank. There's been efforts to outlaw Hezbollah. The Europeans, to their credit, made some movement. The goal, in my view, should be a full ban of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is reportedly sending recruits, combatants to Syria right now from Eastern Europe. They're organizing. They still can fundraise in Europe. This is hard to believe. It's happening in March 2014. There's over 1,000 Hezbollah members in Germany who are very active. Many of them live in my neighborhood. I can see the stores and some of the connections there. But it's legal. So that's one prescription policy, is to target them. Bahrain has outlawed Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. The other GCC states, the monarchies, could also take a more aggressive approach. They've started to clamp down on the finances. The third thing would be African countries, and Nir will be talking about this. Nigeria has declared, in their rhetoric, they haven't put this into practice, that Hezbollah's military wing is a terrorist organization. It's the first time in Africa that I'm aware of where an African government has actually said something along those lines. And then lastly, in terms of Iran, this is, I know, highly unpopular right now, and I'll end on this note. The Yuri Labrani, the head of the Israeli mission to Iran between 1973 and 1978, who actually predicted the collapse of the Shah's regime, gave an interview to the Jerusalem Post many years ago to David Horowitz, who's now with the Times of Israel, but when he was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, he conducted an amazing interview. You can find it online. And Yuri said, what needs to happen with Iran is President Obama, Western leaders, the so-called moral Western democracies need to stand up appeal to the Iranian population that you're dealing with a regime that's stoking terrorism, that's hurting your standard of living, that doesn't allow you to tweet, doesn't allow you to use Facebook and all these different platforms, et cetera, and begin to think about ways of, I guess, dissolving the Iranian regime, because we're dealing with a regime where terrorism is integral to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Thank you.